Mary Jimmy Shinn was born on January 11, 1953, but she was affectionately called Bobo by everyone who knew her. One of 5 children, she was born and raised in Magnolia, a town in southwestern Arkansas, an area where her family had deep ties. Her father, Gresham, had grown up on a farm north of Magnolia, and her mother, Sue, was born in Sparkman, approximately 60 miles away. Both Gresham and Sue attended college in Magnolia, at what was at the time called Magnolia A&M, but would become Southern Arkansas University by the time Bobo graduated from the school in 1976. Gresham went into real estate development following his graduation, and in 1949, he and Sue founded their family business, Magnolia Lodging. The couple developed more than 50 properties together over the course of their career, mainly hotels and motels in Arkansas and Texas. Sue was also very active in civic and charitable endeavors in the community. She loved the arts, particularly theater, and served on the Magnolia Arts Council. Bobo was in certain ways a good mixture of both of her parents. She was active in her community from a young age as a Girl Scout. In 2014, one of her classmates would write to the local paper to share the story of how Bobo responded to the integration of Magnolia schools. The classmate, who was African American, recalled the uneasiness she felt coming into the previously all-white school, and how Bobo's acceptance of and friendliness towards her new classmates inspired other students to behave in the same manner, making what could have been a difficult transition much easier. Bobo loved the arts like her mother, but whereas Sue preferred the theater, Bobo had a passion for studio art. After graduating from college, she opened up a small art studio in Magnolia and began teaching art classes out of it. She also shared her father's interest in real estate and purchased a house on McNeil Street to refurbish and resell for profit. Rather than outsource most of the labor the home needed, Bobo did it herself. On the morning of July 20th, 1978, 25-year-old Bobo went for a walk and then into her studio, where she taught a morning art class. While the day started off normally, Bobo would not return home at her usual time. She still lived at her family home, and Mrs. Shinn became worried when it was almost time for dinner, but Bobo had not made it back. She began calling around to Bobo's friends to see if they knew where she was. Bobo had taken an ad out in the local paper for the home she had renovated and was now trying to sell. Her friend Anita, whom she had met because she was dating a friend of Bobo's boyfriend, had called Bobo at her studio that morning. Anita was still a student at Southern Arkansas University and often spent time with Bobo in the afternoon, after she was done with her classes and Bobo had finished teaching her lessons. Their favorite place to spend time that summer was the pool at the motel on Main Street Gresham Shinn had recently built. When Anita called Bobo at 11 a.m. that day to ask her to get together that afternoon, Bobo could not immediately commit to any plans. She was waiting to hear back from a man who was interested in potentially buying the home she had just renovated. She promised to call Anita back after she found out if she would be showing him the house that afternoon or not. Bobo called Anita back just a few minutes after hanging up from that first phone call. The prospective buyer had just called her back, and he had a house just outside of Magnolia he was interested in trading her house for. She was going to meet with him, but hoped to be able to see Anita afterwards. "Come looking for me if I'm not back this afternoon," she joked before hanging up the phone. Mrs. Shinn was also able to learn that the man her daughter was meeting was having his car serviced at the Pontiac dealership in town, and had arranged for Bobo to pick him up at the Easy Mart across the street from it. No one seemed to know his name, however. Mrs. Shinn decided to drive over to the dealership to see if they could provide her with any information about the man. She arrived at the dealership just as the employees were closing up for the day. They did not have any cars in for service that could have belonged to the still unidentified potential homebuyer. One of the dealership employees was able to tell Mrs. Shinn that he had seen a car that looked like Bobo's blue 1976 Buick pick up a man in the Easy Mart parking lot around noon that day. After sharing that information with Bobo's mother, the dealership employee then left to go home. His involvement in the search for Bobo was not over yet, however. As he drove down Main Street, he happened to see a blue Buick parked behind Smitty's grocery store. He pulled into the parking lot to see if anyone was around the vehicle. No one was. However, the scene inside the car was concerning. Bobo's white tennis shoes were on the floor by the pedals, and her sunglasses and a novel were thrown on the passenger seat. Her purse, wallet, and the keys to the car were still inside of it. The only thing that would be found to be missing was Bobo's address book, which authorities would later speculate had been taken to prevent them from gathering any information about the man Bobo had her meeting with that day. The dealership employee immediately drove back to work to tell Mrs. Shinn about what he had found, and she in turn notified the police. A massive search for Bobo was carried out, and her family quickly offered a reward in the case. Originally, it was $10,000, but eventually it grew to $25,000. Witnesses were able to help the police put together a timeline. Employees at Smitty's had noticed Bobo's car in the parking lot at 1:30 that afternoon. A witness at the Easy Mart had seen a dark-haired man come into the store to get change for the payphone around 11 a.m., just before Bobo received the call from the man who was interested in her investment property. After the story of Bobo's disappearance, and photographs of her car, appeared in the local paper, the county tax assessor, Henry Irwin, came forward with a potential sighting of the vehicle. Mr. Irwin had been baling hay on his property on July 20th. Around noon, he saw a blue Buick traveling down the highway, weaving back and forth. It appeared to him that the man and woman inside the car were struggling as they drove. A carpenter had been working across the street from the house Bobo had been trying to sell. He came forward with a sighting of her on the day she disappeared, but this account has since been called into question. The carpenter said that he saw a woman he believed to be Bobo around 11:30 a.m. on the day Bobo went missing. Shortly after she arrived at the home, a man with brown hair and a mustache drove up in a dark green Pontiac. He and Bobo went inside the home and came back out after approximately 10 minutes. They then each got into their own cars and drove off in the same direction, with the man following Bobo. The problem with the sighting is that it does not line up with where Bobo was planning to meet the man who was interested in trading houses with her. It is possible that she ended up meeting with two men that day. The man the carpenter saw and the man seen getting change for the payphone, who may or may not have been the man who spoke to Bobo on the phone in between her calls to Anita, were similar in appearance, but appear to be two different individuals. The man the carpenter saw had facial hair, whereas the one seen at the Easy Mart did not. It is possible that Bobo received another phone call from a second man interested in her property after she hung up from her second phone call with Anita. However, the timeline would be very tight, especially given the fact that some reports say that Bobo went home to change clothes before going to meet with anyone about the property. It would only have taken about 5 minutes for her to drive from the Shinn family home to the house on McNeil Street, but since she couldn't have left her studio before 11:15, it would have been difficult for her to meet someone at the investment property by 11:30. It is not impossible, however, and even with this potential second meeting, she would have had enough time to get to the Easy Mart to pick up the man as the dealership employee had witnessed. If Henry Irwin's timing is correct, and it was Bobo's car he saw swerving down the highway, then it appears this man attacked Bobo straight away, never going to the home on McNeil Street with her. Seeds and grasses had been found all along the bottom of Bobo's car, as though it had been driven through a field. Given the fact that Bobo's car had been seen driving at noon and was abandoned at the grocery store by 1:30, the car could not have been driven very far away in that limited amount of time, which in theory narrowed down the search area. Even if the car Henry Irwin had witnessed at noon was not actually Bobo's, the time frame is still not widened by very much, as Bobo was still at her art studio until after 11 that morning. Despite the extensive searches and manpower dedicated to the investigation, Bobo has never been found. The investigator most closely tied to the case is Mike Lowe. Lowe had been with the Arkansas State Police for just 10 months when Bobo went missing. While he was not immediately assigned to the case, he was immediately connected to it. His hometown was not far from Magnolia, and he was a graduate of Southern Arkansas University. While he was a student there, Bobo Shinn had sat in front of him in one of his history classes. While he and Bobo were no more than casual acquaintances, he was still shocked to see her familiar face in the newspaper, alongside an article about her disappearance. The following May, Lowe was sent to Magnolia to serve as the lead investigator for the state police there, allowing him to work on his former classmate's case, which the other investigators in town were still working as thoroughly as they were when Bobo first went missing. The carpenter, who had been working across McNeil Street from the home Bobo was trying to sell or trade, had helped develop a composite sketch of the man he said he saw with Bobo the day she disappeared. A considerable amount of time and resources had been put into distributing the sketch and interviewing men who resembled it during the first several months of the investigation. However, by the time Mike Lowe joined the investigation, the investigators who had been working on it since July were beginning to believe that the composite sketch was actually of a man who lived several houses down from the home Bobo owned and was unrelated to the case. Mike Lowe shared their concerns. While law enforcement's desire to close the case never waned, they eventually began running out of new avenues of investigation. While the Shinn family appreciated all of their work, eventually presenting Mike Lowe with a piece of Bobo's artwork in appreciation for all of his efforts, they were desperate to have all possible resources focused on finding Bobo, and so they also hired private investigators to work on the case as well. While authorities believed that it was most likely that Bobo had been killed by the man who called her about her investment property on the day she went missing, in October of 1979, her family was still hopeful that she was somehow still alive, even though more than a year had gone by without any sort of ransom demand. They had already gone through 2 private investigators, and that month they reached out to the third and most controversial investigator they would hire. William Deere was a Texas-based private investigator who had recently garnered national attention for finding James Dallas Egbert III and returning him to his family. Gresham Shinn hoped that Deere could likewise help reunite his family with Bobo. While Deere did not believe that Bobo was still alive, he nevertheless took on the case. After arriving in Magnolia, Deere performed his own interviews and carried out his own searches. In part due to the composite sketch based on the carpenter's account, Deere eventually focused his investigation on a man from the next county over, Michael Morse. Morse had taken his own life several months after Bobo went missing. He resembled the sketch, and the carpenter claimed, based on a photo, that he was the man he had seen. Because of his resemblance to the sketch, Morse had been interviewed by the authorities within a week of Bobo going missing. When Deere interviewed Morse's boss, he said that he had taken July 20th, 1978 off to go meet with someone about real estate. Deere claimed that a psychic called him on the phone and told him that Morse had buried Bobo's body on top of his own father's coffin. On November 20th, 1979, Dewey Morse's grave in the Western Cemetery next to Missionary Baptist Church was exhumed, but no extra body was found in the grave. Despite this setback, Deere publicly announced that he would solve the case within the next 2 weeks. This, of course, did not go over well with the authorities who had been working on the case for over a year, who did not appreciate his arrogance. While the Morse family did consent to the exhumation of Dewey Morse's grave, they filed a $2 million lawsuit against William Deere less than a month after it occurred. Sam Tatum, who had been the head of the State Crime Commission at the time, was also initially named in the lawsuit, but was later dropped from it. Michael Morse's widow, Norma, and his mother, Corinne, sued for emotional distress and invasion of privacy. They claimed that Deere had engaged in extreme and outrageous conduct in publicly accusing Michael Morse of abducting and killing Bobo, using information received from a so-called psychic and through other similarly bizarre sources. Deere would later say that the tip that led to him exhuming the grave had not actually come from a psychic. He had made up the story about a psychic calling him with the information in order to protect an informant. In June of 1981, a civil jury ruled in Deere's favor in the lawsuit. While Deere has long since been off of Bobo's case officially, when reporter Paul McDonald interviewed him in 2016, he said he was still investigating it on his own. He claimed that he had recently heard from a new informant who had passed a polygraph. He could not name the informant out of concerns for his safety, because he was implicating someone who was still alive. The informant believed that Bobo was buried on a specific piece of property, just outside of Magnolia. Deere says he emailed Mike Lowe with this information, but was asked to relay it to the county prosecutor. Not trusting the prosecutor to follow up on the information, Deere decided to finance a search of the property himself. As of the publication of McDonald's article on Bobo's case in March of 2016, he was still working to secure the necessary permissions to do so, and it does not appear as though the search has since been carried out. In the decades following Bobo's disappearance, Mike Lowe has performed more searches and followed up on leads all over the state of Arkansas and the southern United States. The intensity of his focus on the case has not diminished despite the passage of time. In 2010, he retired from the Arkansas State Police. He then ran for and was elected Sheriff of Columbia County, and continued his investigation into Bobo's disappearance in his new role. In January of 2015, Sheriff Lowe worked with a team of 3 other investigators to revamp the investigation. They looked at all of the evidence again and re-interviewed witnesses. The information was organized into a new file that Lowe submitted to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. He has also resubmitted evidence for more sophisticated testing than was available in 1978. So far, these efforts have not resolved the case. Both of Bobo's parents passed away without ever learning what happened to their daughter, her father in 1986, and her mother in 2012. In 2014, her brother and 3 sisters decided they wanted to celebrate Bobo's life, despite the lack of information about exactly how it ended. On July 19th, the family gathered in the Memorial Park Cemetery to dedicate a headstone for Bobo, next to the plot shared by her parents, where they hoped to one day lay her to rest. Later that day, the family and the community gathered for a memorial service for Bobo at Central Baptist Church in Magnolia. The service featured multiple musical performances, memories, and speeches, one of which was given by Dr. John Stubblefield, who had served as pastor of the church in 1978 and knew Bobo. For those who are perpetrators of evil, be sure that your sin will find you out. Not that God will find out about your sin, He knows it, but the sin will be exposed, he said at the service. It is my hope and prayer that someone, even at this date, might come forward and share something that would help bring closure to this family.